Hi, this is Paul. I've been doing a commentary on Matthieu Pageau's The Language of Creation, and I'm up to chapter 4. And so I'm going to be reading this chapter 4 with you, but I'm also going to be taking a look at the foreword to History in English Words of Owen Barfield, because I think they actually deal with the same thing. Let's start with Pageau's first book. Chapter 4, Reconstructing the Language of Creation. Rediscovering the biblical perspective will be the equivalent of learning an entirely new language because all concepts will need to be redefined according to the spiritual worldview. And I've talked a lot in the previous commentaries about how, again, I don't have better language, but the models for spiritual, biblical, material, these are the words at hand, but we're really looking for something deeper in this. And I like actually the way Pageau works through some of this with his single quotes or double quotes. Most importantly, the words heaven and earth, as quoted in the verse above, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, can no longer refer to what we now call heaven and earth from our scientific viewpoint. What's interesting is that we don't usually use the word heaven in our scientific viewpoint. We might use the word sky, okay? And this is where, these languages all have worlds that they inhabit. They all, in a sense, are agents within a specific language arena. The third plan... most importantly, the words heaven and earth, as quoted in the verse above, can no longer refer to what we now call heaven and earth from our scientific viewpoint. The third planet from the sun and its atmosphere. Again, earth, what do we think of when we think of earth? And this is actually what Pageau is trying to get at, because as I was looking at Lewis in Miracles when he's talking about London as Euston Station, or I might think of New York City as the World Trade Centers, or the Statue of Liberty, or, places I'm familiar with in New York. I might think about San Francisco as Golden Gate Park, or the Golden Gate Bridge, or the Bay Bridge, or the Museum of Science, California Institute of Science, et cetera, et cetera. These New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, heaven and earth are all too large for us to capture, and so we sort of shorthand them in a variety of ways, including language. So what Pageau's trying to get at is that heaven and earth are shorthand for some things. Now, what things? How do they function? And if you remember, I think John Walton's the Lost World of Genesis 1, that's sort of a functional creation that Walton looks at. So it can no longer refer to as heaven and earth from our scientific viewpoint, the third planet from the sun and its atmosphere. Instead, the archaic concept of earth refers to the lower material half of the entire universe, and not even, in fact, even half, just the lowest layer, not half at all. And see, part of what this gets into is there are slight differences between, let's say, the implied worldview of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament from the Old Testament. So there's actually a lot going on in the biblical worldview. The archaic conception of earth refers to the lower material half of the entire cosmos. And again, material? Because it's the focus again isn't really on the matter of it. And the archaic concept of heaven refers to the upper spiritual half. And again, I don't think the words material and spiritual really do that well to get at the old categories. And again, this isn't a criticism. This stuff is really hard. In general, a complete definition of cosmic categories like heaven and earth, time and space will be needed. The implications of these concepts will then trickle down to every level of human experience to define all things in the context of the Bible. To simulate an immersion into the archaic perspective of Genesis, visual aids will always accompany the text in this commentary. These diagrams will emulate the pre-conscious conditioning that time and space imposes on the human mind. Okay, now what's interesting here is that time and space, we're not really talking about what time and space is imposing on the human mind, because one might theoretically imagine the time and space that we are living in is the time and space that the biblical writers were living in. It's the cultural, communal, symbolic, linguistic world of these places. Okay, not really time and space. So here he's got some diagrams. We've got spatial axis, we've got heaven and earth, we've got the side view and the top view. So time is looking at things from above, and space is within, and the side view, heaven and earth. So we're talking about the two worlds, two-world dichotomy here. In parallel, another didactic tool, single quotation marks, will be used to highlight the distinction between current concepts and their ancient counterparts of the Bible. For example, in the following quotation, God prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah, and he was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And he's using single quotes around fish. The word fish has been highlighted with single quotes to distinguish the archaic concept of fish from a modern taxonomical definition. A gill-bearing aquatic craniate animal that lacks limbs with digits. Instead, a more ancient concept should be assumed, one that certainly includes other animals as dolphins, whales, and other aquatic creatures. Again, but this obviously goes far deeper, because it's not just a water creature, because of course the seas are more than just water. They are the view from the inside, not just the outside. It's not just what they're made of, H2O. It's what they mean in the cultural, symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary. Instead, a more ancient concept should be assumed, one that certainly includes such animals as dolphins, whales, and other aquatic creatures. Of course, neither of these definitions is correct or incorrect. They are simply based on different cosmologies. And again, we're using cosmologies here as the logos of the cosmos. That's what cosmology, cosmology is. Modern taxonomical definitions are grounded in evolutionary science, while ancient bestiaries were answering the question, what spiritual truth does the animal embody? Okay, now we've got that word spiritual there. How are we going to think about that word? Because, and this demonstrates my critique of this, that, okay, what heavenly truth, yes, but that doesn't really get at it. What pattern truth? Again, think about spirit as school spirit. Well, what does that mean? Well, and where does that reside? The animal embodies a particular truth. It's this stuff is really hard. Breath of God hovered over the face of the waters. Oops, not scrolling that neatly. Come on. Okay. In the verses above, the concept of water perfectly illustrates the breath of God hovered over the face of the waters. He put waters in single quotes. The verse above, the concept of water perfectly illustrates the need to recover the meaning from ancient cosmological concepts. And he's right here, because waters don't just mean H2O. The Spirit of God was concerned about H2O. No, what are the waters? What do the waters mean? What do they signify? We're getting symbolism here. Indeed, from a scientific perspective, the definition of waters can easily be given H2O, which is simply its chemical composition. However, this type of definition only answers the question, what is it made of? And again, we're looking back at Walton. And how does it work? Okay, now this is where Walton and Pageau sort of part company, because Walton will say that's more of the structural functional that Genesis is getting at, and Pageau's trying to get at something else. These are the only concerns of the materialist. Materialist perspective, and this is where we have the manifest image and the scientific image. Therefore, it would be naive to assume that the concept of water in the Bible necessarily refers to the same substance as its modern counterpart. Instead, it is perfectly conceivable that water was synonymous with our current notions of liquid or fluid, which is much broader definition. And I would say when, for example, in Exodus, the waters of the Nile are turned to blood, a modern skeptic would jump in and say, well, let me get a test tube of that so I can see if it's really blood. And this is where so-called literalism runs into trouble, because the Nile turning into blood has a deep, symbolic, rich meaning, but they're not concerned at all about the chemical composition of the water. But a modern literalist might jump up and down demanding that, no, it's real blood. Okay, is it animal blood? Is it pig blood? Is it dog blood? Is it cow blood? Is it whale blood? Is it fish blood? And you see, and this is the game that you can play with literalists, because they're not thinking about blood in the way that blood functions in the Bible. And this is the great power of what both Pageaus are doing, because they're saying they're pushing a certain reading back and saying, now wait a minute, when the Bible says blood, it means something. And one might say, well, we have a prefiguring of the blood of Christ and the blood of the Nile. And right away, people start to freak out. But you're working with these concepts in different ways. And this, of course, is the value of Pageau's book. Instead, the perfectly conceivable water is synonymous with our current notions of liquid or fluid, which have broader definitions. If this were the case, then there would have been many different varieties of water, meaning liquids, in the ancient conception, including blood, wine, urine, milk, mercury, and many other fluids. Okay? God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Similar, from the scientific perspective, a working definition of light would be as follows: electromagnetic radiation with a wavelength on the range of 4,000 to 7,700 angstroms. As expected, since physics studies matter and its interactions, this concept would have been framed with materialistic parameters. On the other hand, the concept of light was framed by meaning rather than mechanism in ancient cosmology. Right, so it's sort of the view from the inside. Hence, there were probably many varieties of light in that context, and not all of them made of photons. Now, again, this is where sort of there's a little bit of creation science-y stuff going on here, because how light is functioning, how the word functions, he's trying to separate the word from our scientific imaginary. I'm going to use that instead of the spiritual. The scientific imaginary, and then sort of a literalism that we... OBS crashed on me. So that first paragraph, Lord said, "Let there be light," and there was light. I mean, Pageau is trying to separate, okay, how does light function in the imaginary of this world that we're imagining back in Scripture? Now, using imagining there doesn't mean it's make-believe. It's just that's what we do when we're struggling to understand concepts like this. The main point of these examples is to demonstrate the naivete of assuming that ancient words had the same meaning as their modern counterparts. He's quite right. In reality, there are tremendous gaps between the ancient and modern definitions, such as every word must be reconstructed within the framework of an archaic cosmology. The distinctions between ancient and current concepts will not always be as clear as the examples provided in this chapter. Therefore, the reader may legitimately doubt the validity of this reconstructed language. However, as will be discovered in the following sections, these words will be entirely derived from the cosmological categories of the Bible. Heaven and earth and time and space as described in the narrative of creation. It's important to remember here that the Bible is a library, and so as biblical scholars, they do pay attention to how the words are used within cultural frameworks and times and boundaries, and also within the Bible as such, because often they're using the words to jump between books. This is the hyperlinking that Jordan Peterson talked about. But the Bible isn't really just a time, it's a book. In addition, the Bible itself will serve as a testing ground for this reconstructed language as it is used to interpret its stories, rituals, and laws. In other words, we're going to see how well it all coheres, how well it all fits together. For the reader, this will be the ultimate test as to whether this language of creation faithfully recaptures the biblical worldview. And in that sense, again, you're looking at, does this help make sense? We sort of fit the language in and see if it's working well together. So as I was pre-reading this chapter, thinking about this video, I thought a lot about Barfield because, again, both Lewis and Barfield were dealing with this. And so I pulled out Barfield's history in English words and noted that the foreword to the book is written by W.H. Auden. And I think it's an excellent foreword. So I'll begin there. And I'm just going to read the foreword. Come on, Kindle. You can do it. All the way. There we go. Foreword. I have drawn from the well of language many a thought, which I do not have and which I could not put into words. C.J. Lichtenberg. Many who write about linguistics go astray because they overlook the fundamental fact that we use words for two quite different purposes. So whereas Pageau is saying we have how we're using words now and how they used words then, or how we're using words here versus how they used words there, Auden is pointing out we, at the same time, use words for two different reasons, and that deeply affects the meaning. As a code of communication, whereby, as individual members of the human race, we can request and supply information necessary to life, and as speech in the true sense, the medium in which, as unique persons who think in the first and second person singular, we gratuitously disclose ourselves to each other and share our experiences. Now, one of the ways you could think about Auden here is he is separating the world inside, which is the second of these, where we disclose what things are like on the inside. We use speech for that. And the other one, which is outside, let's say the world of objects, as Jordan Peterson called them. So if you go to a foreign country, of course, the big joke in high school Spanish was, ¿Dónde está el baño? Where is the bathroom? Because if you imagine going to a foreign land, well, you're going to have to relieve yourself, and this is a necessity that simply must be satisfied. And so you'll want to figure out how and when and where you can do that. So that's pretty important. But what Auden recognized is that there's sort of this world of objects out here, and then there's this mysterious inner life here. And this is what he's going to go into, because when we look at wind and spirit, now we're getting into sort of this parabolic knowing with this conversation with Mark and with Mary. What is the relationship between wind and spirit? They were one word. And of course, this is what Barfield and Lewis are working on. Though no human utterance is entirely a pure code statement or a pure personal act, the difference is obvious if we compare a phrase book for tourists traveling abroad with a poem. The former is concerned with the needs common to all human beings. ¿Dónde está el baño? Hence, for the phrases given, there exist more or less equal equivalents in all languages. So, in other words, el baño is the bathroom. It's the place that we have to go quite regularly to take care of our digestive tract necessities. Okay? We have bladders that need to be evacuated and colons that need to be evacuated. So, for example, in The Mandalorian, they're looking for the evacuation tube. I remember with one of the early episodes, and it's like, okay, well, what's the evacuation tube? He's looking for the bathroom. Now, of course, This is common to human beings. If you're digestive, if all these systems are not working properly, you will cease to live. And so what Auden says is that on one level, we have this world where there's a great degree of commonality between us, and we can think of that as the world of objects. But then there's this other use that we use for language. And now, again, to look at where Barfield is going to go with this, why are these two things all mixed up together? I'll keep going with Auden. A poet, one might say, is someone who tries to give an experience its proper name, capital P, capital N. And it is a characteristic of proper names that they cannot be translated or transliterated. And Matthieu is an example of that. I struggle saying Matthieu properly. I could say Matthieu, and I'm probably butchering the name, but there's something about a proper name. So when I went and lived in the Dominican Republic, some people, I just say use Pablo because Pablo and Paul are sort of the same name, but are they? Furthermore, precisely because writing poetry is a gratuitous act, what does he mean by that? In it, as Valéry observed, everything which must be said is almost impossible to say well. It's a gratuitous act. It's a little different from a necessity, like el baño, like the evacuation tube. Whereas most code statements are verifiable or disprovable, and see, now you can already sort of sense the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversation going on here, because in many ways the world of objects, well, that's sort of the goal, to turn everything into code. Everything into code statements. El baño means the same thing. Although does the bathroom mean the same thing in one culture and another? And this is where things get tricky fast. Whereas most statements are verifiable or disprovable, most personal utterances are neither. They can only be believed, doubted, or denied. When we speak as persons capable of good and evil, the important question is not, is what we say the case or not? That would be a world of object. Is it here or there? And again, with a lot of the argument about the existence of God and kind of the modernistic debating we have going on, we want to sort of, and you see this in modernity, turn the world into numbers. And, you know, it was a generation ago that treating churches as a business was all the exciting thing. And, well, we would turn people into numbers, and we would count the numbers, and we'd keep statistics on attendance, and we'd do all of this. And, well, it's management by objective. If you can turn the world into numbers, if you can turn the world into little discrete little Amazon boxes, then somehow you can have control over it. You can wield it. You can manipulate it. But Auden is saying, now, wait a minute, we're using language for two different things here, and let's not lose what we're doing with this. The important question is not, is what we say the case or not, but are we speaking the truth or deceiving ourselves or deliberately lying? Many animals possess a code for communicating vital information about food, sex, and the presence of enemies, etc. And in social animals like bees, this code may be extremely complex. It is even possible that, in the case of animals, geese, for example, are capable of forming personal bonds between individuals. They sound and gesture code may have an element of personal expression, but even if this be so, it is secondary. Whereas the case of human language, personal speech is its primary function, to which we use as a code is subordinate. Oh, this is... You might have trouble understanding why I am connecting this with Pageau's chapter or Pageau's book. Let me keep reading because I think Auden makes it clear. If this were not so, then, like all other species, we should have one language, used and understood by all human beings, with at most single regional dialect differences, like the song of a chaffinch, and this language could undergo no historical change. In other words, if the primary function of language, if language first developed because we were talking about things out in the world, well, we would just have names for things, and that would be primarily how things go. He's making the point that that's not at all what we find in language. In other words, language must have started from this other means instead, not just simply naming things. Now, again, if you think about usually physicalist projections into the past, well, first we talked about cell phone stands, and then we talked about our feelings. And Auden is making the argument, which is a very interesting one, that if that is the case, wouldn't we all have basically the same names for things? Now, Barfield is going to go into this into a measure because there you can, in fact, find continuity between language groups and words and even the sounds of words and things. You know, there's onomatopoeia, there's pow and ouch and all of these things. But something's going on here, and I don't think it's disconnected from Pageau's book. But from the beginning, not only have men spoken many different languages, all subject to historical change, but also no two persons with the same mother tongue speak it in exactly the same way. Think about that. Understanding what another human being says to us is always a matter of translation. In this book, Mr. Barfield is trying to help us to translate correctly, instead of making, as we all do often, the most elementary errors. True understanding is unattainable without both love and detachment. Now we're getting into the caring conversation. And we can only learn to view anything with detachment by comparing it with other things which are both like and unalike. We've got a little bit of relevance realization going on in there. We cannot understand the present without a knowledge of the past, our native land without having spent some time in a foreign country, our mother tongue without a working knowledge of at least 2 other languages. Without such knowledge, our love of ourselves at the present moment, of our country, of our language, remains an ignorant idolatry, exemplified by the Frenchman who said, "The great advantage of the French language is that in the words is that in it the words occur in the order which one thinks them." Let me read that again because I butchered it. The great advantage of the French language is that in it the words occur in the order in which one thinks them. And there's just a little joke in there because, of course, the Frenchman who only knows French very well, that's just the way things go. It's naive. And not pejoratively. And Auden calls it idolatrous because, well, now, giving a little nod to Freud, we're just projecting all around us, aren't we? Can't you talk normal like me? And any spat with someone with whom you are close, a family member, let's say, will involve a whole lot of this. In weaning us from this idolatry, the historical approach employed by Mr. Barfield seems to me much more likely to be effective than the approach of the linguistic analysts. The latter seems to believe that, by the process of demythologizing and disinfecting, it should be possible to create a language in which, as in algebra, meaning would be unequivocal and misunderstanding impossible. Okay. Now, what is Matthieu Pageau trying to do in his book? Well, okay, so we've got this language which is functioning in a symbolic way within the Bible, and we're reading it from a very different world and sort of projecting onto the language, onto the waters, or onto the fish, the categories of our world. And Pageau wants to say we need to stop this, and rightly so. And we need to adopt the categories of the Bible. Well, rightly so. But this question about demythologizing, in a sense, biblical scholars have been pushing at this for a very long time, ever since we sort of emerged from, let's say, a naive perspective about texts and words, and especially about certain kinds of literalism. And the problem that we're going to have is that there isn't sort of a universal meaning code There isn't a universal thing that we can translate them into and then translate them out of again. We are translating them out of one thing into another thing and then back into another thing. It's a very difficult task, and it's amazing it works at all. But human language is mythological and metaphorical by nature. Jonah was swallowed by a fish, a great fish. The waters, the ruach of God, the pneuma of God, hovered above the waters. We're really knocking at the Jordan Peterson biblical series right here because, well, and the Vervaeke stuff, grasping. It's all of this exaptation that we're doing in the process. As Thoreau said, all perception of truth is perception of an analogy. Okay? It's perception of this parabolic thinking. Knife, fork, spoon, daddy, mommy, baby. Dogs are boys and cats are girls. It's all these analogies that we're working at, and we're constantly doing that, and we're always constantly checking them and trying them. And so I would say in many ways what we're doing with the Language of Creation book are we are learning a new language, but we're going to have to somehow try and associate that to our world, and every commentary attempts to do this. Mr. Barfield gives many fascinating illustrations of this process. The English words delirious and... See, part of the problem is that we are in the pattern of reading things silently. And when I go through the process of reading things aloud for these videos, I realize that I sort of capture the words silently in my head and go on. And when I am forced to articulate them, like Matthieu Pageau, I have to pause and come to a deeper understanding. Now, fortunately, Kindle has this all built in. Prevaricate, verb, to speak or act in an evasive way. Derivatives, prevarication, prevaricator, origin, mid-16th century, in the sense of go astray or transgress. From Latin, walked crookedly, deviated. So, prevaricate. All right. Thank you, Kindle. The English words delirious or prevaricate, for example, are derived from the Latin words. See, and this is where they shouldn't have removed the Latin requirement from Calvin Seminary. I would have had to take Latin back in the 1980s, the good old 1980s, as ELO sings. Which originally meant, he tells us, to go out of the furrow and to plow in crooked lines. A secular and therefore foolproof language is an unphilosophical daydream. This is exactly the point Lewis makes. We can only cope with the dangers of language if we recognize that language is by nature magical and therefore highly dangerous. It will always be possible to use language as a demagogue uses it, as black magic, which neither, like the communications code, supplies people with information they need to know, nor like speech, asks for a personal or therefore unpredictable response, but seeks to extort from others mindless tautological echoes of itself. In other words, Sauron-ish. We must not forget, Mr. Barfield reminds us, that 9/10 of the words comprising the vocabulary of a civilized nation are never used by more than at most 1/10 of the population. Think about that. In the Dominican Republic, when I went to learn Spanish, my wife and I went, and she had a college degree in Spanish, and I had none. I learned to talk like a Dominican, and she was horrified that her Spanish wasn't really improving because many of the people we spent our time with had a tiny vocabulary. They got along just quite well with a tiny vocabulary because they could deal with all the code talking of finding this and ¿dónde está el baño? Está allá. But when it comes to education, suddenly our vocabularies improve and we have dictionaries and we have to look at prevaricate And we have to connect it with other words. And, well, why didn't you just say to go astray? Why did you have that word? Well, this is the speech versus what he's saying, the code. So, as Barfield says, what 9/10 of the words comprising the vocabulary of a civilized nation are never used by more than at most 1/10 of the population, while of the remaining tithe, 9/10 of those who use them are commonly aware of about 1/10 of their meaning. We have a hierarchy. Until quite recently, this did not matter very much. Before the spread of semi-literacy and the development of mass media, the language used by 9/10 of the language they had learned at first hand from their parents and their next-door neighbors. Their vocabulary might be limited, they might be aware of many of its possible meanings, but with it they were able to say what they meant to say and to understand what was said to them. In other words, this is the same issue that Pageau was bumping into. These are small groups of people, and they're using the language within each other. But when we start coming out of those groups, and when we're using speech and not code, well, things are going to get tricky. Their ignorance of historical changes in the meaning of words was not a serious handicap because they could not or had no desire to read the literature of the past. The age of innocence, however, has come to an end, and we can never return. Or are we going back into it, as we are now not even teaching college students the books of the past? Today, when all school children and college students are expected to read some English literature, the consequence of such ignorance is that a 19-year-old confronted with the lines, "The aged bloodhound rose and shook his hide, but his sagacious eye an inmate owns," can interpret them as follows. The poor dog was blind, some lunatic had punched his eye out, and kept it. But we must modify Mr. Barfield's warning and say that 9/10 of the population use twice as many words as they understand, myself included. It's no longer a matter of their knowing some of the possible meanings of the words they use. They attach meanings to them which are simply false. We do this all the time. Thus, one can hear a person when he is feeling sick say, "I am nauseous." A reviewer of a spy thriller can describe it as enervating. A famous television star can call a firm of investment bankers, for which he has made a plug, integrity-ridden. So befuddled, how can the man in the street be expected to resist the black magic of the propagandists, commercial and political? Formerly, philology could remain a study for specialists. Today, history in English words and other books like it must be made required reading in all schools. I have deliberately refrained from saying much about the contents of Mr. Barfield's book. After reading it, one's first impulse is to tell others about the many facts in which have surprised and delighted one. I never knew before, for instance, that the first recorded use of the word self-respect in a favorable sense, hitherto the first recorded use of the word self-respect in a favorable sense, hitherto it had always been used as a pejorative akin to selfishness, occurs in Wordsworth's poem, The Excursion. One second impulse is to cite further examples of significant meaning changes. I am fascinated, for example, by euphemisms, and would very much like to know exactly when it was first thought tactful to call the poor underprivileged and the old senior citizens. But on reflection, one realizes that asking such questions is a form of showing off, and that to quote extensively from a book of this kind is as bad as telling readers in advance the solution to a murder mystery. It is a privilege to be allowed to recommend a book which is not only a joy to read, but also a great moral value as a weapon in the unending battle between civilization and barbarism. As Dag Hammarskjöld wrote in The Markings, "Respect for the word is the first commandment in discipline by which a man may be educated to maturity, intellectual, emotional, and moral. Respect for the word, to employ it with scrupulous care, and an incorruptible, heartfelt love of truth is essential if there is to be any growth in a society or in the human race. One could take certain 12 rules and map them right onto these, couldn't you? To misuse the word is to show contempt for man. It undermines the bridges and poisons the wells. It causes man to regress down the long path of his evolution. W.H. Auden. So I wanted to point that out because in some ways, preachers, as well as anyone, want to sort of say, well, in the biblical worldview, and I do that all the time, or in the language of the Bible, but what we're going to be dealing with is something quite different. And the question between speech and code is really going to be important in the question, well, what do you mean by waters? What do you mean by the Nile was turned to blood? What do you mean by the Reed or Red Sea, especially in this age where we're always asking the question, did it really happen? And we might pause and ask ourselves, why are you asking that question? Well, because I want to know if it can be wielded, if it can be turned into technology, if not only if it can happen again, but if I can make it happen on my own terms. So, yeah, sort of as you can see what I'm doing with Pageau's book is, okay, I'm reading Pageau's book, but I'm also reading pieces of other books as we go along because this is not a tricky thing, or this is not an easy thing. And this business about language is not just a matter of, oh, I have information, now I know what the Bible means. And getting to know what the Bible means, I think in some ways is going to be like buying, I remember back when I first started owning cars, I didn't have much money. The cars that I bought were inexpensive cars, not new, quite old, and thus in need of a lot of repair. And even the cars from the 70s and 80s were significantly less complex than the cars that you buy now in the 2020s. And so there's a fair amount of fixing yourself that you could do. And so you could go and get a manual of car repair for a particular car. Now, one could sit through and read that book and at the end of it say, I know the book. But one could also very much argue that you don't know that car repair manual until you would actually what? Tear a car down to its parts and put it back together. Or complete every car maintenance or repair task in that book. But as you see, it isn't a matter of just reading and thinking about the book. It is a matter of somehow decoding that book into your hands and into tools and into steel and oil and having it work and function. So let's keep that in mind as we try to figure out what the Bible says and the questions we bring to the Bible, because in many ways, when we come to the Bible, we're not just looking to know. And so this question of did it happen or not is not merely a historical question. What we're really asking is, can it happen again? Can I wield it, or will I be wielded by it? So I hope this is helpful. This is chapter 4 of Matthieu Pageau's The Language of Creation, and I read with it the foreword to Owen Barfield's History in English Words, the foreword by W.H. Auden.